At 2:27 a.m., every refrigerator alarm in Desert Valley Blood Services began chiming in a different rhythm, until the whole vault sounded like a ward full of failing hearts. I was on my knees between two quarantine coolers with my hands over my ears when I saw the girl in the glass. Not reflected. Inside. She was small enough to disappear behind a stacked red cell crate, maybe 8 or 9. Dark hair clinging to her cheeks as if she'd just been pulled from water. A dozen transfusion lines ran out of her arms and neck and vanished through the seams of the cooler door. Her hospital gown was printed with cartoon suns. I remembered that pattern because I had cut it off her once with trauma shears. Around me, people were shouting my name from different distances in different voices. "Evan, shut the vault! No, open all of them! Don't look at her! She only appears if you already gave something." I crawled toward the glass anyway. The floor changed underneath my palms. Smooth lab tile became waxed hospital linoleum, then rough concrete, then tile again. The blood bags hanging behind the frosted panels started swaying in perfect unison, dozens of them moving to a pulse I could feel in my teeth. The girl lifted one hand and pressed it to the inside of the glass. Her lips moved. I couldn't hear her over the alarms, but I knew what she said because I had heard it once before, years earlier, in the back of an ambulance while Phoenix traffic stalled around us like a bad decision. Don't let them pick only one. Then the lights went out, 48 hours earlier. I took the job because blood doesn't scream. That was the thought I had while sitting in the HR office at Desert Valley Blood Services, pretending not to notice that the clock on the wall ticked too slowly. I had spent 9 years as a paramedic in Phoenix. You develop a tolerance for heat, smell, and panic, but not for memory. People talk about burnout like it's exhaustion. It isn't. It's contamination. One bad call gets into everything after it. Mine was a pileup on Loop 202 after a dust storm, 17 vehicles, one bus, no visibility, children from a church summer program scattered between overturned seats and broken glass. I made decisions. You always make decisions. Then you live with the arithmetic. A little girl coded in the back of my rig while I was documenting the wrong vitals on purpose because I knew an audit would come, and I knew somebody would need to look less responsible than me. That kind of choice follows you into cleaner buildings. Desert Valley sat on the edge of the city, in a business park, where everything looked sun-bleached and temporary. The building itself was huge and windowless, except for a strip of dark glass near the administrative offices. If you didn't know better, you'd think it stored electronics. There was nothing theatrical about it. No Gothic corridors, no basement stench. Just concrete, security doors, climate control, fluorescent lights, and institutional blue signage, reminding employees to report spills immediately. My orientation started at 4:30 p.m. with a woman named Denise Harrow from administration. She had a lacquered voice and the kind of smile you practice for donors and grieving relatives. She walked me through payroll, badge access, contamination protocols, chain of custody procedures, and emergency exits. Everything was standard enough to be boring. Then she handed me the employee handbook. It was thick, spiral-bound, and updated within the last 6 months. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Storage temperatures, shipping regulations, barcode procedures, specimen labeling, disposal guidelines. I almost relaxed. Then I turned to page 42. Do not relocate O-negative units between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. unless specifically authorized by a shift supervisor. That by itself might have passed for some odd internal workflow issue, but 3 pages later, I found this. If storage room 3 feels warm upon approach, close the door immediately and notify no one. Continue other duties until the sensation passes. Not if the room temperature exceeds threshold. Not if the monitor reads abnormal. If it feels warm. I looked up, and Denise was already moving on, tapping a paragraph about incident reporting. Sorry, I said. This part here. Read all safety addenda before your first solo shift. she said, not quite answering me. Night crew relies on consistency. A few pages later, never scan a blood bag twice during the same handling sequence. And, if a donor file appears without a photograph, report nothing, delete nothing, print nothing. Close the screen and log out for 10 full minutes. I remember the exact sensation that went through me then. Not fear, professional irritation. The feeling you get when an institution has been allowed to become eccentric because nobody in charge dares to clean up old mistakes. I thought, weird place, weird policies. I did not think. One version of the building is bleeding into another. At 6:10 p.m., Denise handed me off to night operations. My supervisor was Martin Kessler, senior lab technician, mid-50s, thick glasses, shaved head, wedding ring polished by habit. He spoke quietly, as if the building punished volume. He showed me the intake area, processing stations, component storage, quarantine coolers, plasma freezers, loading bay, and central inventory desk. Night shift is easier than days, he told me. Fewer interruptions, more routine. He said, routine like a prayer. I met 2 other techs before midnight. Gina Patel, who was younger than me, and had the brisk, unfriendly competence of someone who resented explaining simple things. And Russ Danner, who looked like every former Marine who ever found himself in civilian logistics and never quite accepted the downgrade. Both were polite. Neither seemed eager to know me. At 12:40 a.m., Martin walked me to the storage corridor. 4 main rooms were branching off it, each sealed by insulated swing doors with pressure latches and digital readouts. The hall smelled like bleach, cardboard, cold metal, and something faintly sweet under it all, like gauze that had been stored too long. That's room 1, packed red cells. Room 2, platelets overflow and specialty holds. Room 3, quarantine and temporary overflow. Room 4, plasma reserve. Temporary overflow, I said. Meaning? Meaning temporary. He said it without irony. When he left to answer a call at intake, I stood alone in the corridor and reread the addenda in the handbook. The overhead fluorescent tubes hummed faintly. Somewhere farther down the hall, a compressor kicked on. I had just decided management was padding serious procedures with folklore when someone behind me said, "If you keep reading that thing like it's true, you'll get yourself buried in a cooler." I turned so hard I nearly dropped the manual. A woman I hadn't seen before stood near the crash cart alcove. Late 40s maybe. Dark braid over one shoulder. Tan scrubs. No badge visible. Her face was narrow, tired, and very calm. "You're Lena?" I guessed, because Martin had mentioned an overnight records tech by that name. She looked at the handbook in my hands as if it were something dead. "Did they give you the updated version?" she asked. "I guess." Of course they did. She reached into her scrub pocket, pulled out a folded sheet of yellow paper, and held it toward me. "Put that in your locker. Don't let Martin see it." I hesitated. If this is a joke, it isn't. Her eyes stayed on mine. "And if room 3 ever feels warm, you do not walk away from it. You open the door. You check inside. You make sure nobody's been left." That contradicted the handbook so directly that I almost laughed. I unfolded the sheet. The handwriting was compact, written in black ink over older faded blue, as if several people had updated the same page across years. The first rule read, "Always reopen quarantined coolers. Someone may still be inside." Below that, if a donor file appears without a photograph, memorize the name. If the name changes while you're looking at it, write both versions down. And then, if you scan a unit and the donor record matches an employee, do not tell management. Ask the blood who it used to belong to. I looked up at Lena. "What is this?" "The version that used to keep us alive." "Used to?" A noise came from the far end of the corridor. A cartwheel squeaked once. When I glanced toward it and back again, Lena had stepped closer without my noticing. "Do you know why they hire medics for nights?" she asked. Because we're used to bad hours? Because you already know what it feels like when records and reality stop agreeing. She touched the handbook with 2 fingers, not taking it from me. They're going to tell you there was a fire here 8 years ago, and the overnight records got corrupted. If Gina says that, don't believe her. If Martin says the handwritten rules belong to people who died in that fire, don't believe him. Ask to see the memorial plaque. Ask why it has names nobody remembers. Before I could answer, Martin called my name from intake. I looked toward his voice, answered, turned back, and the hallway was empty. No braid, no yellow sheet in her hand, nothing except the folded page now tucked under my thumb and the steady refrigerated breath coming through the seams of the storage doors. At 1:03 a.m., Martin had me verify an incoming cooler from Tucson. At 1:17, I signed for platelets. At 1:24, Gina showed me the scan sequence for relocation holds and said, without prompting, "Don't let Lena fill your head if she's still doing that." I went very still. "Lena?" Gina frowned at me. "Who?" "The woman from records. There is no night records tech," she said. "Not since the fire." Then she took the yellow sheet from my hand, looked at it, and all the color left her face. "That isn't Lena's handwriting," she said quietly. "That's mine." The sheet slipped between us, fluttered to the floor, and when I bent to pick it up, it was no longer yellow. It was a fresh white page torn from the back of my official handbook. At the top, in neat printed text, was a rule I knew I had not read before. If 2 employees give you different orientations, continue working. Both may be correct. The first week trained me to distrust relief. Nothing dramatic happened at first, which was almost worse. I learned the routes between the processing lab and storage, with a scanner holstered at my waist and a clipboard tucked under my arm. I logged temperature variances, rotated inventory under supervision, broke down incoming shipments, separated units flagged for serology review, and memorized the irritating little habits of the place. One refrigerator door needed an extra shove at the latch. One workstation monitor took 30 seconds to wake up, unless you hit the mouse twice. The loading dock intercom crackled whenever the wind picked up from the south. It was all ordinary enough that I started to wonder whether I had brought the strangeness with me. Night work does that. Once you're tired enough, every building becomes a small psychology experiment. The fluorescent lights strip your sense of time. The same hall can feel 6 degrees colder because you had one bad thought in it. I had worked enough ambulance bay overnights to know how quickly the mind invents weather, so I kept quiet. I didn't mention the woman in the corridor again, mostly because I couldn't decide whether I had really seen her. Gina and Russ acted as they'd always worked together. Martin gave orders in the same flat, procedural voice every shift. If I hinted around the subject, I got versions of the same answer. There had been a small electrical fire years earlier in record storage. No casualties, some paper loss, some system migration issues, lots of myths left over by bored night staff. That explanation would have held if the building had cooperated. On my 3rd shift alone, I counted 6 units of AB plasma in freezer 4 at 12:12 a.m. At 1:01 a.m., there were still 6, in the same slots, with the same donor codes, but one expiration date had changed from November to August. Not relabeled, changed. The printed sticker was continuous, untorn, and slightly glossy under the freezer light, as though it had always read that way. I brought it to Gina. She looked at the unit for less than a second and said, "Then log what it says now." "You don't want to check the prior scan?" "No, it had a different date 40 minutes ago." She zipped the cooler case closed harder than necessary. "Then you saw the wrong one." That answer irritated me enough to push. "You ever worry you all ignore things here that should be incidents?" She gave me a long look. "You ever work a code and know exactly when you lost the patient," she said, "but keep compressions going because paperwork hasn't caught up yet?" I didn't answer. "Then you know incidents aren't the same as changes," she said. Some things are only dangerous if you make them official. After that, she refused to elaborate. The strangest anomalies arrived in small, almost administrative ways. Donor identification numbers would route to blank files that the system insisted were active. A shipment manifest from Flagstaff listed 2 courier signatures in different handwriting, under the same employee ID. Once, while reconciling a platelet transfer, I opened a donor profile and found a street address 3 blocks from the apartment where I'd grown up in Mesa. But the city listed under it was not Mesa. It was West Mesa territory, as if some municipal detail from another century had bled through. The equipment had moods too. Every refrigerator in the storage hall occasionally entered the same low compressor cycle. But one night, around 2 a.m., the hum synchronized so perfectly that it sounded less mechanical than respiratory. An inhale, a soft hold, an exhale. 20-odd cooling systems breathing together in the dark corridor. Russ noticed me listening. "Don't count with it," he said. "With what?" "The pattern." He kept labeling a crate without looking up. "If you start matching your steps to it, you'll lose time." That was the kind of statement that would sound like a joke in any other workplace. Here, he said it the way you tell someone not to lean on a broken railing. I tried to find the edges of the problem. Sleep deprivation, stress, some elaborate culture of institutional superstition, maybe. But then the system used my name. It happened during a routine relocation check at 1:48 a.m. I pulled a red cell unit from temporary overflow, scanned the bag, and glanced at the monitor while it loaded the donor profile. For less than a second, the line on the screen populated with my employee number. Not as an operator, as donor. Donor ID, EV3119 Morales. My badge number was EV3119. Under sex, age, and blood type, more fields began to autofill. I saw male, 31, O positive. I saw a home address I had left 3 years earlier. I saw a section labeled prior transfusion history. Then the screen blinked. The proper donor profile returned. Female, 56, Tucson Collection Center. No anomalies. I stood there with the scanner still pointed at the bag. Gina was 2 stations down, checking seals. Computer glitch? I didn't answer fast enough. She looked over. What'd it show? I should have lied. Instead, I said, my employee number. To my surprise, she didn't flinch. That happens to everyone eventually, she said. Russ, behind me with a transport cart, muttered, not everyone. I turned toward him. What does that mean? But he was already moving past. That was when I realized the worst thing about the night crew wasn't that they believed something impossible. It was that they had developed categories for it. Ordinary, manageable categories. Things that made no sense, but occurred often enough to rank somewhere between nuisance and hazard. By the end of the week, I had my own set of private observations. The little field notes you keep when you no longer trust official language. The break room microwave was always 3 minutes fast, after 2:22 a.m. The janitorial closet beside records had 2 different lock plates, depending on which direction you approached it from. Storage room 3's digital temperature display never read abnormal, but my hands sweated whenever I passed it. Twice I found donor files in the system with no photographs. The first time I closed the screen and walked away, following the handbook. The second time I stayed long enough to memorize the name, Amelia Vance. When I reopened the file 10 minutes later, the name had become Amelia Vaughn. Same donor number, different face. I wrote both down on the back of a shipping label and kept it in my pocket until dawn. By the time I got home, the ink on the second name had feathered into the paper until it looked older than the first. I started sleeping badly, not because of nightmares exactly, because my dreams were procedural. I was back in ambulance reports, backdating timestamps, correcting respiration counts, changing one digit that turned blame into ambiguity. Only now the patients kept waking up to watch me write. On my 6th shift, Martin asked me to help with a quarantine cooler audit. Official sequence only, he said. standing with a clipboard at the center island. No deviations. Meaning? Meaning if a cooler is sealed, you verify seal integrity, not contents. If a bag has been scanned once, you do not rescan unless the system prompts it. If a donor record fails to populate, you log deferred resolution. He watched me too carefully while he said it. Has somebody been doing it differently? I asked. There are old habits in this building. From who? He smiled, but only with his mouth. People who aren't here anymore. We worked in silence for 20 minutes. At 2:09 a.m., I carried a quarantine crate toward room 3 and felt, unmistakably, a wash of dry heat through the insulated door seam. Not a lot. Just enough to feel wrong in refrigerated storage, like opening an oven in a cold house. My hand stopped on the latch. Close the door immediately without looking inside. Always reopen them. Someone may still be inside. The two rules arrived together, equally authoritative. What are you waiting for? Martin called from behind me. I looked back. He stood at the end of the corridor with his clipboard tucked against his chest. For a strange second, the hall looked longer than it should have, as if he were much farther away than the building allowed. The fluorescent lights between us seemed to pulse out of sequence. Did room 3 always? The latch moved under my palm, not because I pulled it, because something on the other side pressed softly against it, like weight settling. Then came a sound, a small metallic chirp from my scanner. I looked down. The unit I was carrying, still unscanned, still in my hands, had activated the reader by proximity alone. The display flashed once, loaded a donor line, and in bright green letters across the screen read, Previous holder, Evan Morales. Not donor, not recipient, holder. When I looked up again, Martin was no longer at the end of the corridor. A woman in tan scrubs was standing there instead, braid over one shoulder, one hand raised in a warning I already understood too late. Don't let it learn your order, Lena said. Then every refrigerator in the hall inhaled at once. The human mind can live beside almost any horror if it can sort people into camps. Once I accepted that something was wrong at Desert Valley, my next instinct was to identify who was lying, who was confused, and who was dangerous. That was the old EMS habit. In a chaotic scene, establish command, locate bystanders, separate useful witnesses from panicked noise. The problem at the blood bank was that every witness came with evidence, and every piece of evidence arrived carrying its own weather. The first clear split happened in the break room at 1:30 a.m. on a Wednesday. I say break room, but room with a vending machine and a table nobody relaxed at would be more accurate. Russ was stirring powdered creamer into coffee that smelled scorched. Gina sat with the official handbook open, not reading it. Martin was on the phone in the corridor, voice too low to make out. I had the folded handwritten rules in my pocket again. I don't remember putting them there. Tell me the truth, I said. Who was Lena? Neither of them answered immediately. Russ leaned one hip against the counter. Who told you that name? She did. She can't, Gina said. Why not? Because she died in the fire. Russ snorted. There was no fire. Gina's head turned toward him with open disgust. There was absolutely a fire. Electrical surge and sprinkler discharge, he said. Records loss, not fatalities. She stood up so fast her chair legs scraped. I went to the memorial. You went where they told you it happened. I knew Marisol. He stared at her for a beat too long. No, you didn't. The room changed without moving. That is the cleanest way I can explain it. Same walls, same coffee smell, same flickering vending machine light. But suddenly, I had the unmistakable sensation of having stepped into an argument already 20 years old. Stop, I said. One of you explain this like I'm not already sleep-deprived. Gina took a breath through her nose and pointed at the handbook. Those rules came after the fire, after night records burned, and half the overnight staff died because people started opening sealed coolers against protocol. The handwritten lists are leftovers, ghost procedures, superstitious nonsense. Russ gave me a look that was almost pitying. Management wrote the handbook after they sealed off half the old floor and pretended the missing people had transferred. There was no fire. The handwritten rules are what kept the original crew alive. These people are dead, Gina said. These people are still on shift, Russ replied. I remember thinking then that one of them had to be messing with me. It was the only sane interpretation. But then both of them reached for proof at the same time. Gina pulled out her phone and opened a saved image. A brass memorial plaque mounted on a stucco wall, titled, "In Memory of Our Night Staff," followed by 6 names. One of them was Lina Gutierrez. The date beneath the plaque read 8 years earlier. There were flowers at its base, sun-faded and dry. Russ turned the monitor at the break room workstation toward me. On the screen was security footage from the storage corridor stamped with a date from the same year. I saw staff moving crates through the hall. I saw Russ himself, younger and heavier. I saw a woman with a braid, Lina, walking past room 3 alive and arguing with a man whose face blurred each time he crossed under a ceiling light. Then the footage skipped. At timestamp 02:22:14, the corridor filled with static, not visual noise exactly, but overlapping frames, 2 or 3 movements occupying the same hallway at once. When it cleared, several people were gone. Where'd the others go? I asked. Russ didn't answer. Gina had moved beside me. That footage is edited. It came from internal archive, he said. It came from nowhere. The server migration corrupted years of night files. And your plaque has 7 names in the other version. She went white. What? Russ pointed. Zoom in. Her fingers shook only a little as she pinched the image. The plaque enlarged. For one instant I saw 6 names, then 7, then 6 again, as though the lettering couldn't settle. The extra name was nearly rubbed away by sunlight or time, or something worse. Evan. No, not Evan. The letters shifted before I could finish reading them. Gina locked the phone and shoved it into her pocket. Enough, she said. But the damage was done. We weren't arguing over causes anymore. We were arguing from different histories. Over the next 2 shifts, the split became harder to dismiss. People I had met once seemed not to know me the next time. Badge access logs showed entries by employees Martin claimed had resigned years ago. The janitorial closet by records sometimes contained mops and solvent, sometimes old boxed files, and a tape recorder on a folding chair. The same corridor camera footage displayed 2 different sequences depending on which terminal I used to access it. There was no pattern I could prove, only the suffocating sense that the building preferred divided testimony. I began noticing that the crew themselves moved in 2 social gravities. Martin and Gina rarely crossed into records unless necessary. Russ did. So did a phlebotomist named Nora, who only seemed to exist after 2 a.m. Martin claimed she covered weekends. Russ claimed she'd been there longer than he had. Once I watched Martin greet her by name at intake, then heard him 10 minutes later insist to me, with no sign of deception, that we had no phlebotomy staff on overnights. I stopped trying to pin anyone down in direct conversation. Instead, I watched habits. Management rule people never reopened quarantined coolers. Handwritten rule people always checked seals twice, then broke them if a latch looked misaligned. Management people refused to acknowledge missing donor photos. Handwritten people copied names on scraps of paper and kept them in their pockets like saints' cards. Management people never rescanned a bag. Handwritten people rescanned only if the first scan displayed someone they knew. The most disturbing thing was that both systems seemed to work, as long as they weren't mixed. One night Martin had me rotate specialty units from one shelf to another. Russ walked in, swore under his breath, and moved them back the second Martin left the room. Later, while reconciling counts, I found both shelf orders logged in the system with matching timestamps and no discrepancy flagged. It was less like sabotage than simultaneity. On Friday, I finally asked the question that had been building under all the others. What exactly are we protecting the blood from? Russ answered first. Cross-contamination. Gina, from the opposite side of the room, said at the same time, recognition. They both stopped. Recognition? I repeated. Gina's face shut down. Russ rubbed a hand over his mouth and looked away. That's not your lane yet, Martin said from the doorway. Something in me gave out then. Not courage exactly, but patience. I had spent months after the accident hiding behind formal language. I was done with people who weaponized procedure to avoid meaning. Then put me in the lane, I said. Because either this place is running some kind of psychological experiment on the night staff, or I'm losing my mind, or both of you are managing different disasters and pretending they're the same one. No one answered. The silence stretched until the compressor system in the hall started its low, synchronized hum again. Inhale, hold, exhale. Nora appeared in the doorway behind Martin as if the building had placed her there for contrast. She was in her 20s, hair tucked under a disposable cap, expression solemn in a way that made her look younger. He should see the footage from 3, she said. Martin turned sharply. No. He already has the overlap symptoms. Symptoms? I said. Nora ignored me. If he keeps picking rules from both sides without context, it'll get worse. Martin pinched the bridge of his nose. Gina looked exhausted. Russ looked vindicated. For a moment I had the absurd impression of family members deciding whether to tell a child about a hereditary illness. Finally Martin said, "One recording. Nothing leaves this room." We gathered around the records terminal in the darkened office. The air back there always felt drier, older, like paper warming in unseen heat. Martin entered a code I hadn't seen before. An archive folder opened, then another inside it labeled simply 3. The video began with a static shot of Storage Room 3's door from inside the corridor. Timestamp, 02:21:48. At 02:22:03, the hallway lights dimmed. At 02:22:10, the image split, not on purpose, not an edit. The frame itself seemed to widen, duplicating the corridor by a few inches, and then by feet, so that the door to room 3 occupied 2 slightly different positions at once. In one version of the hall, Martin stood near the center island. In the other, Russ did. Then both. Then neither. Figures moved in and out of each side, some familiar, some not. Lena appeared near the crash cart. Gina crossed from left to right, carrying a clipboard in one frame and a cooler in the other. None of them acknowledged the duplicates. They behaved like workers in separate buildings. Then the door to room 3 opened in both versions. I expected darkness. Instead, I saw, for less than a second, rows of hospital beds extending into impossible distance under dim amber lights. Patients lay in all of them, some asleep, some sitting upright, some watching the doorway with the still attention of people waiting to be called by name. The frame spasmed. The corridor returned. Timestamp, 02:22:58. The rest of the footage showed normal storage activity, if you could call anything after that normal. My mouth had gone dry. That's fake. No, Nora said. I pointed at the screen. That room is 8 by 12. In here, Russ said. In here? Martin closed the folder before I could rewind. That's enough. But one detail had already lodged in my mind like shrapnel. One of the patients in the farthest visible bed had lifted her head as the door opened. A child, dark hair, cartoon suns on her hospital gown. And though the image was grainy and the clip lasted no more than a heartbeat, I knew, with the cold certainty reserved for old guilt, that I had seen that face once, in the back of an ambulance mirror, while I was choosing which lie would save my license. I told myself I entered Storage Room 3 because curiosity is stronger than superstition. That wasn't entirely true. Curiosity had gotten me to the door. Guilt turned the handle. By then, I had spent enough nights in Desert Valley to understand the one rule everyone shared: no matter which version they followed. Avoid becoming the center of the anomaly. People here survived by staying adjacent to the impossible. They logged around it, worked around it, built small systems of denial around it. I had done the same thing with the accident. I had corrected forms and revised times and changed a child's last documented oxygen saturation because the truth felt too narrow to live inside. The trouble with hidden guilt is that it responds to recognition like iron to a magnet. If the girl in the footage really resembled the one I had failed, then either my mind was contaminating the building, or the building had found the exact shape of my weakness. I needed to know which. The opportunity came during end-of-shift inventory, when Martin was occupied with a courier discrepancy, and Gina had gone to intake to reconcile a spoiled platelet return. Russ, for reasons he did not explain, was nowhere I could see. The corridor outside the storage rooms was unusually quiet. No carts rolling, no printer chatter from the main lab, just the refrigerated hum and the fluorescent buzz overhead. It was 2:16 a.m. I stood outside room 3, holding a clipboard I wasn't reading. The digital temperature display beside the door read 4 degrees Celsius. Normal. My skin disagreed. The insulated metal radiated a dry, close heat, like a long-shut car in summer. I glanced once over my shoulder. No one. I pressed the latch. The door opened soundlessly. At first I saw exactly what I should have seen. Metal shelving, labeled crates, the narrow aisle, the overhead refrigeration unit, the pale floor reflecting institutional light. Then the air changed. Not temperature, pressure. The room deepened with impossible speed. The back wall receding as if drawn on a track. Shelf uprights became IV poles. White tags became wristbands. Plastic bins became bed rails. Storage room 3 unfolded into a ward. The ceiling rose. The cold fluorescent light mellowed into low amber panels set somewhere above vision. Rows of hospital beds stretched into darkness in both directions. Too many to fit inside the building. Too orderly to be hallucination. Every bed held someone attached to a transfusion line. Some were old, some young, some bandaged, some seemingly healthy. Their faces had the wrong stillness, not dead and not asleep, but waiting. The clear lines running into their arms glowed a diluted red in the dimness, and many of them were awake. They watched me with the quiet attention of people who had been told I was late. I could smell antiseptic, saline, warmed plastic tubing, old linen, and underneath all of it, the penny metal smell of blood, diluted almost beyond scent. My shoes squeaked on a waxed floor I knew did not exist. The clip on my badge felt suddenly heavy against my chest. "Hello?" I heard myself say. The sound did not travel correctly. It went out, hit distance too soon, and came back softer. A patient in the nearest bed turned his head toward me. Middle-aged man, oxygen cannula, skin gray, with chronic illness. There was no fear in his expression. Only recognition so weary, it might have been affection. "Too early," he said. Several others murmured at once. Not loudly. More like people finishing a sentence in their sleep. "He's early. Not this version. Look at his hands." I took one step backward. The ward did not permit retreat. The doorway behind me had become just another interval between beds, hung with a half-drawn privacy curtain that shifted gently in non-existent airflow. On my left, a woman with a shaved scalp and sunken cheeks raised one hand from her blanket and pointed toward the far end of the room. "She's awake tonight," she whispered. I followed her finger. There, several rows down, separated from the others by a ring of suspended transfusion bags hanging from wheeled stands like clear red lanterns, was the child. She was smaller than I remembered, and older at the same time. That makes no rational sense, but neither did anything else in the room. And her hair was dark and damp looking around the temples. Her hospital gown bore faded yellow suns. Lines entered both arms, one at her collarbone, one under the edge of her jaw. She sat upright against pillows, eyes fixed on me, expression calm in the way very sick children sometimes are when adults around them have exhausted their panic. I knew her, not by name. I had never learned that, but by the particular cruelty of recognition, the angle of her chin under the oxygen mask, the tiny scar near her eyebrow, the impossible intimacy of having once counted compressions over a body too small for the force required. My knees almost failed. The old reflex came back, the medic's denial. Assess, verify, observe details. Don't feel until later. I looked at the monitor hanging beside her bed. No hospital system I recognized. No standard telemetry. Just waveforms drifting in and out of one another, as though several patients' vitals were layered on the same screen. The ID panel above it cycled through text too fast to read. Names replacing names. Dates replacing dates. The girl lifted one hand. Not a wave. A warning. Behind me, somewhere very close, a door alarm chirped. The ward stuttered. For 1 second I saw both rooms at once. The impossible hospital and the ordinary storage space occupying the same coordinates. Bed rails aligned with shelving. Transfusion lines with hanging units. Patients with labeled blood bags tucked into bins. Every bin had a face. I staggered back into the corridor hard enough to hit the opposite wall. The room 3 door slammed shut in front of me, latch snapping into place. Martin was at the end of the hall, shouting my name. By the time he reached me, Gina and Russ were with him from opposite directions, as if summoned by different emergencies. "Did you open it?" Martin demanded. "Of course he did," Russ said. Gina grabbed my wrist. "How warm was it?" "What? How warm? I don't know." Her grip tightened. "Did you go in far enough to touch anything?" I looked down at my shoes. They were streaked with pale yellow wax that did not match the corridor floor. Russ saw it too. He exhaled once through his nose, almost like resignation. Martin's face emptied of blood. "Get him to records." "No," Gina said sharply. "Not records." "Then where?" The 3 of them looked at one another with naked distrust. It occurred to me then that whatever had happened to me in room 3 was not merely dangerous. It was politically dangerous. In this building, knowledge belonged to factions before it belonged to people. "I saw a hospital ward," I said. My own voice sounded distant. There were patients. They were getting transfusions. And there was a girl. No one asked what girl. That was the part I understood too late. No one asked because all of them already had their own answer. The cameras did not help. Security footage from the corridor showed me standing in front of room 3 with one hand on the latch for 18 seconds, then stumbling backward into the wall. The door never moved, not even a vibration. "You never opened it," Martin said, as though that settled the matter. "Then how?" I held up my shoes. Gina knelt and scraped a thumbnail across the wax. Pale residue gathered under it. She smelled it, face tightening. "Hospital floor polish," she said. Russ gave a short, humorless laugh. "That narrows it down." "Stop," Martin snapped. But I was already spiraling into a more practical terror. If the door had not opened on camera, then either I had blacked out standing upright in a corridor, or the building had begun excluding evidence by category. When they finally let me sit, it was in records, despite Gina's objections. The records room was colder than the rest of the building, and cluttered with compact shelving, archived boxes, dead monitors, and one long table under a task lamp. I sat there watching my own hands tremble, while the others argued in low voices outside. On the far wall hung a framed evacuation map. I stared at it because it was something flat, something supposedly stable. Then I noticed there were 2 storage room 3s on the plan. Not marked differently, not hidden. Just there. Both labeled plainly in the same blueprint, overlapping at a slight offset, as if whoever drafted the map had leaned the transparency twice before locking the image. When I stood to get closer, my chair legs scraped. The sound echoed longer than it should have. From somewhere inside the compact shelves came the soft plastic clatter of cassette cases shifting. I turned. A narrow gap had opened between two archive rows I was sure had been flush a moment earlier. Beyond it, half concealed in dust and banker boxes, sat an old tape recorder on a metal stool. A handwritten label on the cassette read, "Director's Notes, Night Containment." If rooms diverge outside the records office, someone pounded once on the door and shouted for me not to touch anything. I had already pressed play. The first thing on the tape was breathing. Not dramatic breathing. Not someone hiding or dying. Just the close microphone hiss of a man settling himself before speaking. Then came a voice. Male, educated, tired. Southwestern vowels smoothed by years of formal meetings. He sounded like the kind of physician who learned to say impossible things only after trying every ordinary explanation first. "This is Dr. Adrian Vale," he said, "Medical Director, Desert Valley Regional Blood Repository. If you are listening to these notes without my direct instruction, conditions have already progressed beyond the point at which policy remains useful." The tape clicked softly. Paper rustled. "I am recording separate summaries because written memoranda have become unstable after convergence windows. If this message has survived intact, audio may still resist whatever form of overwrite affects visual and textual records." I remember gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles hurt. The pounding at the door outside had stopped. Either they had given up, or I had stopped hearing it. Dr. Vale continued. "In 1989, our research unit documented a series of clerical anomalies involving donor histories that could not be reconciled through error, fraud, or software corruption. Blood components from unrelated donors occasionally carried immunologic traces, suggesting exposure events impossible in recorded medical history. We initially suspected contamination or falsified intake. We were wrong." Another breath. "Whole blood remembers." He let the sentence sit long enough for absurdity to drain out of it. "Not metaphorically, not spiritually in any folk sense. I mean that under certain conditions, donated blood appears to retain patterned biological information, derived from lives not entirely lived here, histories adjacent to ours, variants, near outcomes, persons who exist in one record and not another. The effect is not constant, and in most facilities it goes unnoticed because blood moves quickly. But repositories, particularly overnight repositories with long cold holds, allow accumulation." The fluorescent light above the records table buzzed once. I didn't move. "Every donation," he said, "is an act of intention as much as extraction. Someone gives blood, believing it will save a stranger. That expectation appears to create a weak associative bridge, not only between donor and recipient, but between all versions of that act, across neighboring realities. Usually those bridges remain separate. Under temperature-controlled storage and repeated low-stimulation conditions, they begin to recognize one another. Recognize. Gina's word. On the tape, Vale coughed into his hand. The overnight shift exists because daylight volume masks the early stages. At night, with reduced activity, the inventory settles. Similar components drift toward one another conceptually before they do so physically. Records change first, then labels, then placement. Finally, under convergence conditions, spatial correspondence itself becomes unreliable. I found myself whispering ahead of him. Labels, placement, spatial correspondence. As if hearing a diagnosis for symptoms I had already memorized. Contradictory procedures emerged because the first containment measures functioned only locally. One reality favors non-rotation of O-negative reserves between 1 and 3 a.m. Another requires periodic rotation to prevent donor memory adhesion. Both are correct, within their own continuity. Catastrophe occurs when staff from one procedural environment adopt the rules of the other without realizing they are working during overlap. The room felt smaller, or maybe the idea in it had grown too large. Outside the partially open shelf gap, I heard footsteps moving through the records room. More than one person. None of them came toward me. I stayed still and listened to the tape. If you are hearing this after the second phase, you may have encountered personnel whose histories do not align. Do not assume deception. They may be preserving a version of the bank that is equally real to them. The fire reported in one branch did occur. The absence of fire in another branch is also correct. Casualties are contingent. Memorials may expand or contract. This is not symbolic behavior. The archive is averaging. I shut my eyes briefly. The archive is averaging. That phrase did more to break me than the hospital ward had. There is something uniquely hateful about discovering that your contradictions are not madness, but administration at a higher order. The tape ran on. Storage Room 3 demonstrates the earliest and most severe architectural instability. During windows of convergence, its interior corresponds not to storage volume but to transfusion occupancy, the sum of active and unresolved recipients linked to repository holdings across neighboring branches. Do not remain inside if observed by patients who appear to recognize you. Recognition accelerates reciprocal indexing. I didn't know what that meant, but my scalp tightened anyway. There is one recurrent pediatric manifestation, Vale said after a pause. Female, approximately 8 to 10 years of age, variable injury profile, often attached to multiple lines. Staff reports that she appears in branches associated with failed emergency care, interrupted transfusions, or donor intention under acute distress. She may speak. If she addresses you by name, record the wording immediately. Do not allow management to classify her as hallucination. I opened my eyes. The task lamp on the table had switched itself on. I do not remember touching it. In its narrow cone of yellow light, the dust on the tabletop had been disturbed by several fresh fingerprints that were not mine. Vale's voice grew rougher, more hurried. You will be tempted to choose one rule system and remain loyal to it. This is understandable and strategically catastrophic. The procedures were never moral truths. They were local negotiations with incompatible continuity. Remember that. The rules are not sacred. They are traffic signals at a crossing no one built correctly. The cassette clicked. For a second I thought it was ending. Then he spoke again, much softer. If overlap has advanced far enough for an employee to be identified as donor before donation, containment has failed at the personal level. That individual is no longer merely observing branch convergence. He is being entered into it retroactively. The air left my lungs in a small, involuntary sound. He may see recipient networks attached to his unresolved guilt profile. He may become legible to units he has never handled in this branch. If this occurs, do not permit transfusion of any unlabeled or self-recognizing component until the individual is removed from the repository. The tape stopped. For a long moment, all I could hear was the soft motor whine of the cassette spools at rest. Then someone spoke from the other side of the shelf. Did he get to the part about you? It was Lena. I stood so fast the chair tipped backward. She was in the gap between shelves, half in shadow, exactly as I remembered. Braid, tan scrubs, tired eyes, no badge. But now I could see details I had missed before. The hem of her scrub top was singed on one side. One sleeve was darker, watermarked, as if it had dried after soaking. There was a small line of puckered scar tissue running from below one ear into the collar. You're dead, I said. So are a lot of records. She glanced at the tape recorder. Doesn't stop them showing up. Behind her, in the records room proper, another figure moved past the aisle opening. Martin. He didn't look in. What are you? I asked. Her expression didn't change. Night shift. That's not an answer. It's the only one you get until you stop sorting everything into alive and not. I wanted to demand more, but another question got there first. Why me? She looked at me with something that might have been pity. Because the bank likes unfinished things, she said, and you came here full of them. I laughed once, harshly. That's not science. No, she said. It's triage. From deeper in the archive came the clack of a rolling shelf unlocking on its track. The floor beneath us gave a small, almost imperceptible shiver, like a train passing somewhere below ground. Lena's eyes lifted toward the ceiling. It's starting early. What is? The overlap. She stepped back into the dimness. You need to understand something before they make you pick. Pick what? Which set of dead coworkers you want to believe in. I moved after her. The aisle beyond the gap seemed longer than it should have been, shelves stretching into amber gloom. Wait. She stopped beside a stack of old donor archive boxes and tapped one lid with her knuckles. You think the rules contradict because someone made mistakes, she said. They contradict because both sides are trying to protect transfusions that have not happened yet in their own world. If the wrong memory rides the wrong unit into the wrong patient, that patient doesn't just get sick. They inherit an alternate burden, a history, a grief, sometimes a person. A person. You saw 3. I did not want to say the next part aloud. The girl. Lena nodded. She isn't a ghost, she said. She's a junction. Then, from somewhere beyond the shelves, a voice called my name, in a tone so familiar my stomach turned over. Not Martin, not Russ, not anyone from the bank. A child's voice, strained thin by oxygen and fear. Evan? I had heard that exact voice once, through road noise, sirens, and my own pulse hammering in my ears, while I pressed gauze to a chest wound and told dispatch we were 6 minutes out when we were 12. I shoved past Lena and followed it. The archive shelves narrowed. Banker boxes gave way to old metal filing cabinets, then to hanging IV bags suspended from shelf brackets, then to a corridor that was not physically connected to the records room in any architectural way I could defend. The floor became waxed linoleum underfoot. Behind me, Lena said, sharply now. Don't answer if she asks what happened. Why? Because whichever version you tell her will try to become the true one. I stopped. Ahead, at the corridor's end, I could see the edge of a hospital bed curtain moving gently. The little voice came again, calmer this time. I know you remember the wrong night. Then the lights above me flickered, and every file drawer in the records room slammed shut at once. At exactly 2:22 a.m., Desert Valley stopped pretending it was one building. I know the time because all the clocks changed together. The wall clock in records skipped forward 20 seconds, and then back 10. My wristwatch froze. The taskbar clock on the terminal rolled from 2:21 to 2:22 and began blinking between them. Somewhere in the storage hall, alarms started chirping, not because temperatures were out of range, but because thresholds had multiplied. The overlap was not an explosion. It was a negotiation. The corridor outside records filled with footsteps, carts, voices, and the layered sound of 2 workplaces arriving at once. Doors opened and closed against each other. Someone shouted for quarantine seals. Someone else yelled not to touch the coolers. Through the small window in the records door, I saw Gina pushing a transfer cart toward room 2 while, in the same strip of vision, Nora moved a crate through the space she occupied, neither of them colliding, and yet both undeniably there. Lena grabbed my wrist and pulled me back from the hall. Now you're going to see why everybody sounds insane at 2:22, she said. The records room lights dimmed to a deep yellow, not used anywhere else in the facility. The air grew heavier, warmer, carrying that same sweet metallic smell I had noticed under the hospital scents. Blood in plastic, blood on gauze, blood in memory. Indistinguishable after a point. The door burst open. Martin came in first, out of breath, face pale with anger or fear. He stays with us, he said. A second later, Russ entered from what should have been the solid wall beside the compact shelving, as if another doorway had temporarily aligned there. No, Russ said. He's already cross-indexed. If Harrow's procedures keep control, they'll collapse the branch into theirs. Martin stared at him with the hateful exhaustion of a man who has had the same argument too many nights to count. Your branch already burned. Russ laughed once. And yours already erased the bodies. I backed away until the table hit my thighs. What does branch mean? I asked. No one answered me directly. They rarely did. Instead, I got doctrine, Martin said. We maintain continuity by limiting recognition events. No rescans. No reopening quarantine. No unnecessary movement during window, Russ said. They lock down symptoms and let the blood sort itself toward the strongest narrative. That's how you lose people without noticing. Lena, near the aisle, said, both of them are right often enough to be lethal. That finally cut through. Stop telling me philosophies and tell me what actually happens. The room went quiet for 1 second, as if I had stumbled onto the correct phrasing. Then Nora appeared in the doorway behind Martin, eyes huge in her pale face. The vault is opening early, she said. Which vault? I asked. All of them, she said. The next 11 minutes are the hardest part to render honestly, not because I don't remember them, but because memory itself stopped agreeing on sequence. I can tell you the components. I can tell you the repeated images, but cause and effect began to slide. I remember standing in the storage corridor with 2 groups of staff occupying the same shift like misaligned transparencies. On one side, Martin and Gina affixed additional quarantine tags to certain coolers. On the other, Russ and Lena broke those same tags, checked the contents, and resealed with handwritten initials. Both procedures succeeded in their own hands. When Martin tried to stop Russ physically, his grip passed through Russ's sleeve for half a second before finding resistance, as if contact itself had to choose a reality before committing. I remember seeing the digital inventory board display 2 different shelf maps simultaneously. In one, O-negative reserves remained fixed. In the other, they rotated one position every 90 seconds. Units moved and did not move. The counts balanced and refused to balance. Every time I focused on one arrangement, the other slid into peripheral certainty. I remember room 3's door standing open, though no one admitted opening it. Beyond it lay not always the ward, but sometimes the ordinary shelving, sometimes an intake bay crowded with gurneys, sometimes a dark expanse full of hanging red lines like roots underwater. Each glimpse vanished if stared at directly. I remember Gina shouting at me not to scan anything twice. I remember Lena shoving a scanner into my hand and telling me the second scan was the only way to tell if a unit had started recognizing personnel. I did both. The first unit showed a donor from Yuma. The second scan, 1 second later, showed a dead courier named Miguel Serrano. The third showed no donor at all, only the word, returning. I dropped it. That was when Dr. Vale's tape finally made operational sense. Each method worked inside its own continuity. Combined, they didn't cancel out. They produced legibility. The blood stopped staying politely symbolic and began identifying how many histories it could belong to. At 2:24 a.m., the refrigerators began breathing again. This time, everyone heard it. At 2:25, a sealed quarantine cooler from room 3 rattled on its cart. Martin ordered no one to open it. Russ said someone could be trapped inside. The latch bowed outward once with a muffled thump from within. Nobody touched it. At 2:26, Nora screamed from the central terminal. On her screen, donor files were opening by themselves and populating with employee badge photos. Martin's face appeared beside a unit collected 20 years before his hire date. Gina's name attached to pediatric platelets. Russ listed as both donor and prior recipient on the same line. My own employee number spread through 3 separate profiles like ink in water. At 2:27, the intercom announced a shipment arrival from a hospital that closed in 1998. At 2:28, I saw 2 versions of myself at the end of the corridor. One was only a reflection in the glass of room 4, but it moved a fraction late. Same scrubs, same badge, Same tired face, different posture. My shoulders looked narrower on him, younger somehow, and there was dried blood on one cuff. He raised the handheld scanner like a man about to identify me. Then the glass frosted white from within, and he was gone. "Do not let your alternate observe you for long," Lena said near my ear. "If he resolves, one of you becomes record." What does that even mean? It means whichever history has more support survives the paperwork. That should have sounded ridiculous. In that building, at that hour, it sounded administrative. The factions finally said the quiet part aloud at 2:29. Martin cornered me near room 2 with a steadiness that felt rehearsed. "Listen to me carefully. We can stabilize this branch if we keep procedures clean until the window closes. Minimal scans, no unnecessary access, no cross-checking unknown units. If the other continuity collapses, it was already unstable." "You mean if it dies?" I said. He didn't blink. "You're using the wrong vocabulary." Less than a minute later, Russ caught me by the loading bay and said almost the same thing from the opposite direction. "They want their version to dominate because it's simpler," he said. "Fewer contradictions, fewer ghosts in the records. If their continuity wins, everybody we lost stays lost. Everybody on our side becomes error. We can lock this bank to our line if we open the compromised coolers and vent the mixed inventory before 2:33. You're telling me to blow containment. I'm telling you containment is just another word for choosing who counts." That landed harder than anything else, because I knew exactly what it meant to decide who counted. I had made that choice with a pen years earlier. In the middle of the corridor, under lights that now flickered between white and amber, the little girl appeared again. Not walking in, simply present. No one else seemed surprised. She stood barefoot on the cold floor in her hospital gown, transfusion tubing trailing behind her into nothing visible. Her face was thinner up close, older than 8 in the eyes, younger everywhere else. Both factions went quiet. "Tell him," Lena whispered. The girl looked at me, not them. "You keep calling this a choice between two," she said. "It isn't." Then every cooler in the hall clicked, one after another, as if locks were cycling in sequence. 2:30 a.m. The window had 3 minutes left, and the building was about to ask me to commit the exact sin I had come there to hide from. Simplify a catastrophe by deciding which version of a life deserved the record. When the girl spoke my name, the corridor around us receded. Not vanished, receded. The others were still there, doubled in amber and fluorescent light, arguing in distant fragments, but they felt pushed behind glass. I had seen children in shock become eerily lucid. I had heard 8-year-olds ask practical questions while adults dissolved around them. None of that prepared me for the composure of this one. She stood in the middle of a blood bank storage hall at 2:30 in the morning, with lines trailing from her wrists into air that sometimes became tubing and sometimes shelving, and she looked at me the way a patient looks at the one clinician in the room who has not yet lied out loud. "You remember the ambulance," she said. My throat closed. "Yes. That's one reason I can find you." It took effort to speak. "Who are you?" She tilted her head, considering. In one place I was Maribel. In another I was Mara. In one, I never made it out of the bus. In one I lived for 6 weeks and needed 12 units. In one, I died before they typed me. She looked down at the line entering the back of her hand. It doesn't stay one answer for long. The smell of saline and warm plastic strengthened. Behind her, for a second, the storage hall became the ward again. Rows of beds, donors translated into recipients, every bag hanging like a possible history not yet chosen. "I don't understand what you are," I said. "No," she said gently. "You understand. You just don't like it." That was fair. The others kept their distance. Martin watched like a man observing a bomb technician work. Russ had stopped pretending he was unafraid. Even Gina, who distrusted every supernatural explanation available, looked sick with recognition. The girl lifted one of the hanging lines and let it sway between her fingers. "People think blood is only a sample," she said. "They forget it's a promise. Someone gives it believing it will cross into another body and keep a stranger alive. That belief reaches farther than they do. Across realities," I said, hearing Dr. Vale in my own voice. She smiled faintly. "That's your word for it. What's yours?" Trying again. That hurt more than I expected. She stepped closer. Her bare feet made no sound on the floor, whether it was tile or linoleum or both. "Every transfusion makes a bridge. Most are tiny. A feeling, a dream that isn't yours. A memory of a room you never stood in. But some people become crossings. Patients who should have lived somewhere. Donors whose blood was taken in too many endings. People who are named by the wrong bag." I looked at the scanner still clenched in my hand. "You said you can find me. Because it showed my name? Because you're in the blood now." I heard Russ curse softly behind me. Martin took one involuntary step forward, then stopped. "That's impossible," I said. She held my gaze. "Is it? And because the universe can be cruel with timing." I remembered the blood on the trauma cot rail that night. Not hers. Mine. A split across my knuckles from shattered glass, dripping into the mess while we worked. I had wrapped it with tape and kept going. Minor exposure. Unremarkable. The sort of small contamination nobody documents when a child is coding, and you're already behind. My stomach turned. "You got my blood," I said. "In one place," she said. "In another, you donated later. In another, you never left the scene." The corridor lights dimmed further. The walls around us shivered with superimposed geometry, storage labels over curtain tracks, door frames over bed partitions. She went on, as if we had all the time in the world. "The rules helped at first. One side learned not to move certain units because movement let recognition spread. Another learned movement was the only way to keep matching bags from settling together. One side stopped rescanning because names repeated if you looked too hard. Another rescanned because the second answer told the truth about overlap. All of them were patchwork, temporary, small things people did to survive inside a mistake." "Whose mistake?" I asked. This time her expression changed. Not anger, weariness so old it looked structural. "Everyone's," she said. "Mine. Yours. The doctors who kept trying. The people who kept donating because hope is repetitive." She turned slightly, and for a moment I could see beyond her to the ward. Dozens, no, hundreds, of transfusion lines fed out through walls, floors, door seams, cooler vents, each line leading to some unseen elsewhere. Every bag in the repository was part of a web. No wonder the building breathed. "You're trapped here," I said. "I'm distributed here." That word was colder. "And if one reality wins," she glanced toward Martin's side, then Russ's, "then part of me gets called error and cut away. Same if the other wins. People you can still hear would become glitches in paperwork. Patients linked through them would remember the wrong saves, or no save at all. Blood would still work. That's the ugly part. The bodies would survive. They'd just carry cleaner stories." I knew then why the horror of the bank felt so intimate. It wasn't that reality might collapse. It was that collapse would look like normal administration. A cleaner inventory. Fewer contradictions. Better compliance. Whole branches of suffering reduced to filing mistakes no one felt obliged to mourn. "I'm not asking you to save me," she said. "I'm asking you not to simplify me." The sentence hit with surgical precision. That had been my crime from the start, not failing to save her, though I had. My deeper failure had been simplifying the aftermath until I could keep living inside it. A changed timestamp, an adjusted note. A version of events with fewer jagged edges. Behind us, one of the quarantine coolers slammed against its cart hard enough to rattle the corridor. Martin raised his voice. "Evan, we are out of time," Russ answered over him. "He knows what time costs." The girl didn't look away from me. "They want you because you've already learned how to choose between versions and call it procedure." I flinched as if slapped. She saw it. "Did you think this place picked you by accident?" she asked softly. "You came here because blood banks feel clean, because nobody screams, because inventory looks like mercy from far enough away." That was almost unbearable because it was true. I swallowed hard. If I don't choose either side, what happens? For the first time, uncertainty crossed her face. "If you break both systems at once," she said, "the overlap may widen too far for one branch to dominate. The bridges could collapse instead of consolidating." Could? Yes. And if they collapse, the blood goes back to belonging to one world at a time. That sounds good. "It is," she said, "unless you're standing inside the crossing when it happens." Martin started toward us then, decision finally overcoming caution. "Enough." The girl turned her head slowly and looked at him. He stopped dead, not from force I could see, but from the way people stop when a patient starts speaking in a voice too old for their body. "You keep trying to cure the symptom that proves the others existed," she said. Martin's face hardened. "We are preventing contamination. You're preventing grief from having paperwork." Russ let out a shocked little breath. Gina looked away. I understood then that the thing in the bank was not mindlessly hostile. Adaptive, yes. Inconsistent, yes. But curious too, and personal. It addressed whatever moral lie you had built your life around. The scanner in my hand chirped by itself. The display lit up with a list of units in active proximity. Dozens, then hundreds. No donor IDs, only names. Some repeated. Some crossed out and replaced as I watched. Some I recognized from memorial plaques, staff badges, and donor files. One line at the bottom stayed steady. Morales, Evan. Matching components detected plural. I looked up. In the frosted glass of room 4, my reflection had returned. There were 3 of me now, aligned at slight offsets. In one version I was older, hair grayer at the temples. In another I still wore the dark blue uniform of Phoenix Fire, trauma shears clipped to my belt. All 3 watched me lift the scanner. The girl followed my gaze. "There," she said. "That's what they're afraid of. Not me. You." "Why?" "Because once the blood recognizes a living holder across branches, it stops staying in storage. It starts looking for a body that can carry the contradiction." I felt suddenly, violently cold. "You mean me?" "I mean whichever of you answers first." The cooler latches all clicked again. 2:31 a.m., 1 minute left to choose, or refuse. The decision did not feel brave. It felt familiar. That is the part I distrust most in redemption stories. The moment where a person becomes nobler than their habits. I didn't. I became more honest about the habits I already had. Under pressure, I break procedure when procedure becomes a mask for cowardice. That flaw ruined part of my life. It may also have saved whatever remained in Desert Valley. I looked at Martin, then Russ, then at the 3 versions of myself trembling in the glass, and understood that both factions wanted the same absolution in different language. Simplify the disaster. Preserve a continuity. Call the losses necessary. I had done that once already. "No," I said. Martin's jaw clenched. "Evan." "No," I said again, louder now. "I'm not helping either side erase the other." Russ took a step toward me. "Then everyone loses control." "Good." Gina stared at me as if I'd started speaking another language. Maybe I had. The girl did not smile. She only closed her eyes briefly, like someone hearing a difficult answer she had hoped for anyway. The first thing I did was walk to the nearest quarantine cooler and flip the latch. Martin lunged. Russ grabbed his arm. The cooler door swung open. Inside were 6 packed red cell units in neat racks, and, for half a second, the curled shape of a man in tan scrubs with his eyes wide open, pressed between crates, as if he had been hiding there without air. Then, the image split, and there were only units again, swaying slightly. Gina made a choking sound. I moved before anyone could stop me, opened the next cooler, and the next. Seal tags snapped. Cold air rolled out, mixed with gusts of warmer hospital air. Every rule I had been given screamed against what I was doing. Do not reopen quarantined coolers. Always reopen them. Never scan a blood bag twice. Scan again if the blood knows you. Do not move O negative between 1 and 3. Rotate them, or they settle together. I obeyed all of them by violating all of them. I began pulling units from shelves and rescanning them in rapid sequence, then tossing them into different bins before the system could resolve which donor history it preferred. I rotated entire racks out of order. I keyed open sealed transport containers. I dragged the emergency release on room 3 and let the door gape. Chaos arrived like floodwater, finding every crack. The corridor elongated, split, and filled. Staff from both branches collided into full visibility now, no longer ghosting past one another, but resolving in jerks of shared resistance. Gina shouted at another Gina who appeared at the far end of the hall with a different haircut and a burn scar up one forearm. Russ saw an alternate version of himself wheeling a cart through the loading bay and froze long enough for both carts to crash together. Nora doubled and redoubled between intake and records, like frames misfed through a projector. Every opened cooler became a mouth. I saw overlapping contents in each: blood units, patient limbs, donor files, stacks of wristbands, personal effects sealed in specimen bags, entire paper charts spotted with old brown stains. The building had never stored only blood, it had stored outcomes. "Stop him," Martin shouted, but nobody could organize around a single reality anymore. The scanner in my hand screamed continuous tones, as if every unit in the facility had entered one impossible handling sequence. Names rolled so fast on the display, they blurred into bands of light. I recognized fragments: couriers, children, phlebotomists, a surgeon from a trauma center I once transferred to, my own name again and again, each time paired with a different notation. Donor, holder, recipient, deferred source. Unknown, not yet collected somewhere. Glass shattered. Somewhere a woman laughed hysterically because the alternative was worse. The wall clocks all read different times. I reached room 3 and went inside. This time there was no brief transition. The ward swallowed the storage room whole. Beds stretched into impossible depth, but now they were crowded not only with patients. Staff moved among them: lab techs, nurses, couriers, alternate co-workers, versions of people from both branches crossing aisles that did not stay parallel. IV lines braided overhead like neural tissue. On every bed monitor, waveforms drifted in and out of one another, like conversations almost remembered. And the patients were changing. Not physically, not in a cinematic way. Their identifying details kept slipping: age, hair, injury profile, the kind of subtle rewrite that makes you doubt your own perception. A woman with chemo bruises became a postpartum hemorrhage case, then a trauma recipient, then a teenager with sickle cell crisis, all while remaining somehow herself. This, I understood with dawning horror, was what every donated memory becomes one actually meant. Not gore, not monsters, dissolution of singularity. The girl stood in the center of the ward, among hanging lines, and looked unbearably small. "Faster," she said. "How? Make it impossible to average." That was a sentence only a blood bank could produce during an apocalypse. I started opening every bedside transfusion clamp I could reach, not to run blood, but to disrupt the neat directional logic of the lines. I unhooked bags and swapped them between stands. I wheeled beds out of rows. I pulled privacy curtains across stations that hadn't existed a second earlier. I made the ward messy, ambiguous, unchartable. Back in the corridor, others had joined the sabotage, though not all for the same reason. Russ was overturning carts to block the central aisle. Gina, my Gina or another, I couldn't tell, was ripping printed shelf labels off bins and sticking them onto different racks. Lena stood in records feeding armloads of archived donor files into the industrial shredder, then yanking them back out half-destroyed so no branch could claim the original sequence. Martin alone still fought for order. He was at the main terminal trying to lock the inventory map, entering override after override while the system displayed shelf positions that no longer matched the building. I saw, over his shoulder, a message flash across the screen. Resolution failure. Too many valid states good, I thought, with something like vicious joy. The overlap became so dense that language itself started slipping. People called each other by names that changed mid-sentence. The intercom announced code deliveries to hospitals, whose names rewrote while you listened. A donor manifest printed in one room as a pediatric chart in another. Refrigerators breathed, monitors beeped, badge readers chirped welcome to employees who had not yet been hired. Then the alternate Evans appeared fully, all three of them. One stepped out of the frosted reflection near room 4. One emerged from the ward in EMS blues, with blood on his cuff. One stood at the end of the loading dock in a button-down shirt and wedding band I had never owned, holding a donor release form. They looked at me with the same exhausted accusation I had aimed inward for years. The medic version spoke first. "You can still document this clean." The older one said, "Pick the line with the fewest casualties." The man with the wedding band said nothing. He just held out the form as if asking me to sign. I nearly did. That was the worst part. Even after everything, some ruined part of me still wanted the cleaner story. Then the girl's voice cut through the noise. "Evan!" I turned. She was fading, not disappearing, but becoming multiple, her outline splitting into near-identical positions across several beds at once. If the overlap went any farther, she wouldn't remain a junction. She'd atomize into every unresolved transfusion promise attached to her. I did the only thing left. I took the scanner and smashed it against the steel edge of a bedside rail. Plastic burst. The screen went white, then spidered black. For one beautiful second, the tone stopped. Then every scanner in the building answered. From the corridor, from intake, from the loading bay, from carts and counters and holsters clipped to belts that may not have belonged to this shift at all. 100 barcode readers woke at once and began chirping in staggered sequence. Not random, responsive, like a flock correcting course. The ward lights flared amber. Above me, the hanging transfusion bags swung outward on their lines, all in the same direction, as if some vast body had shifted in sleep. The alternate versions of me in the corridor faltered. The one in EMS blues raised his hand to shield his eyes. The older one glanced around with sudden uncertainty. The married one looked down at the unsigned donor form he carried, and for the first time, his face became mine, in a way that hurt. Not accusation anymore, but fear. The system could not sort us. Good. I vaulted the nearest bedrail, landed badly, and went for the central manifold where half the lines in the ward converged into a transparent hub the size of a sink drain. It pulsed softly, not like a heart, but like pressure, equalizing in a sealed system. Inside it, diluted reds moved in opposite directions at once. I had no idea whether it was real in any material sense. I only knew that everything in the room treated it like a center. The girl saw what I meant to do. Her face changed. "That will hurt." "Who?" She gave me a tired look. "Yes." I wrapped both hands around the manifold and twisted. At first it resisted with the dense, rubbery give of hospital tubing under strain. Then something deeper gave way. A lock, a seal, a conceptual fastener, whatever this place used instead of ordinary joints. The clear hub split with a wet crack, and every line attached to it spasmed. The sound that followed was not a scream. It was intake, not in the administrative sense. in the human sense. Hundreds of first breaths, final breaths, gasped prayers, operating room commands, donor questions, the rustle of consent forms, the hard plastic clatter of emergency coolers being opened in hallways and trauma bays, and neonatal units, and roadside triage tents, and surgical suites that may never have existed in the same century. The whole bridge network voiced itself in one collapsing exhale. The ward convulsed. Beds slid out of alignment. Curtains lifted in a wind that smelled of antiseptic, dust, freezer burn, and rain on hot asphalt. Every patient in view flickered through 2 or 3 adjacent versions of themselves, so quickly their faces became a kind of moral blur. Then the blur broke apart, not into gore, into singularity. One woman remained bald and hollow-cheeked. One old man remained old. One trauma recipient remained transfused and sleeping. The little girl remained one little girl, for the first time since I had seen her. Around me, the overlapping staff was losing their doubles. One Gina dropped to her knees while the other, farther down the corridor, simply failed to resolve and went transparent around the edges like breath on glass. Russ slammed into a transport cart that existed fully now, and cursed with the honest pain of a single body in a single hall. Martin kept trying to lock the terminal until the terminal itself went dark and reflected only his face but him. The alternate Evans were not as lucky. The medic version of me stepped forward as if to reach for the broken manifold, but his outline shredded into scan lines, then into pale particulate glare that moved through the air like dust in projector light. The older version put one hand against the wall and looked almost relieved before he, too, came apart. The man with the wedding band held the donor form a second longer than the others. He looked at me with something close to forgiveness. Then the paper fell through empty air. The corridor and the ward slammed through each other one last time. I was back in storage room 3. Metal shelves, labeled crates, freezing air. One broken scanner at my feet, my palms bleeding where the manifold, or whatever physical object had stood in for it here, had cut them open. All the coolers in the corridor burst their seals simultaneously. Martin shouted something I didn't catch. Gina was crying and furious at the same time. Russ had one hand pressed to his temple and blood running between his fingers from where a shelf corner had clipped him. Lights died in half the hall, came back, died again, then steadied into ordinary fluorescent white. And in the middle of the threshold of room 3 stood the girl, not luminous, not theatrical, just a tired child in a sun-patterned gown, lines trailing from her arms into nothing I could still see. She looked around the corridor, as if listening for an echo that had finally stopped. "Did it work?" I asked. She considered the room, the staff, the humming machines, the ordinary shelves. "For now," she said. Martin pushed past a cart toward me. "What did you do?" Before I could answer, the girl turned to him. "You don't get to call it contamination anymore," she said. He stopped dead. Then she looked back at me. "You won't remember all of it, right? None of you will. That's part of it closing. I remember enough. Maybe." She glanced at the blood on my hands. "Be careful what sees you now." The temperature in room 3 dropped sharply. A true refrigerated bite at last. Frost crawled in a thin line along the inside of the metal doorframe. The girl took one step backward. For a moment, the ward shimmered faintly behind her. A suggestion only. Rows of beds receding into amber distance. Then it folded in on itself like a reflection, disturbed by a dropped pebble. She was gone. No dramatic disappearance. One blink, and the threshold held only cold air and shelving. We spent the next hour in wreckage and denial. Some doors had to be forced back onto tracks. Inventory was catastrophic. Units had shifted shelves without any logged movement. Several quarantine tags showed seal histories that contradicted the timestamps printed on them. 2 terminals had wiped their local audit buffers clean. One security camera recorded 19 minutes of blank amber. Another showed us working calmly through a routine count. while the actual corridor around us still smelled of opened coolers and panic. No one called police. No one called the state. No one called a hospital to warn them. Reality had briefly failed in a blood repository outside Phoenix. Institutions protect themselves first, and desert institutions do it quietly. By dawn, Martin had already reverted to administrative language. Systems instability, he said. Archive corruption, Gina said bitterly. Containment breach, Russ muttered. I said nothing. When I washed my hands in the lab sink, diluted blood spiraled pink into the drain. For an instant, I thought I saw other blood spiraling with it. Older, darker, not from these cuts. Mine, and not mine. Then the water cleared. Before I left that morning, I went back to records. The tape recorder sat on the metal stool, exactly where I had found it. When I picked it up, the cassette inside had been recorded over. There was only one sentence on it now, spoken in Dr. Vale's tired voice. If no single reality can dominate, the archive is forced to let the living remain unresolved. I took the cassette with me. No one tried to stop me. Desert Valley did not close. That would have been too honest. They conducted an internal review, replaced 2 terminals, transferred 1 administrator, and rewrote the overnight safety addenda into something so bland it felt malicious. Russ quit within a month. Gina stayed. Though the last time I saw her, she looked at every scanner as if it might accuse her personally. Martin shook my hand on my final day and thanked me for my service in the measured tone of a man filing a difficult incident under resolved. No memorials changed while I was there. If they changed afterward, I never went back to check. I transferred north 3 months later to a smaller regional blood center outside Prescott. Smaller building, smaller staff, cleaner books, pines instead of heat-scoured industrial parks. I told myself that mattered. People hear blood center and imagine danger by infection, contamination, the obvious biological risks. They never ask about repetition. They don't understand what happens to a place that handles human intention in sealed units, night after night, shelf after shelf, hope refrigerated, grief categorized, strangers stored under compatible types. My new workplace was aggressively ordinary. The orientation binder was stupidly normal. No bizarre rules hidden in the appendices. No unofficial notes in anyone's pocket. No supervisors who lowered their voices near certain doors. The refrigerators hummed out of sync as machines should. The storage rooms stayed the size they were built. For almost 5 months, nothing happened. That was the worst and best period of my life. I slept better. I stopped waking to imaginary alarm tones. I saw a therapist in Flagstaff and told her an edited version of the ambulance story, then a less edited one, then the part where I had falsified the record. She said words like guilt processing and trauma-linked avoidance and moral injury. She did not say blood remembers every version of the life it failed to save. I let her keep the smaller diagnosis, because I needed one thing in the world that stayed inside ordinary language. I even considered donating. That thought came and went quickly. One December night, with snow threatening over the highway and only 2 of us on inventory because someone called out sick, I stayed late to finish a refrigerated count in reserve storage. The place was quiet enough that I could hear the roof settling. No amber light. No contradictory staff, no breathing refrigerators. Just me. A scanner, a clipboard, and rows of ordinary labeled units. Then I reached the back left corner of Reserve 2 and saw one blood bag hanging alone in a slot that should have been empty. No label, no ABO sticker, no donor barcode, no processing stamp, just dark red packed cells in clear plastic, and a strip of yellowed tape across the front, with handwriting faded almost to brown. I looked around automatically, absurdly expecting someone to claim it as a joke. There was no one. I unhooked the unit carefully and held it to the light. The handwriting on the tape said, "If this bag ever recognizes your name, do not let anyone receive it." My mouth went dry. The handwriting was not Martin's. Not Gina's, not Russ's. It was mine. Not exactly as I write now. Older, shakier, more compressed, as if written under bad light by someone trying not to be seen. But mine, beyond argument. Every ugly little capital letter, every cramped slash in the E. I heard the storage room door click shut behind me. Slowly, very slowly, I turned. No one there. The latch had settled itself. Nothing more. I told myself to put the bag down, walk out, get another employee, use witnesses, use protocol. I had learned at least that much. Then the scanner on my cart activated by itself. The beam did not project red light. It simply woke, screen brightening in the dim aisle. I had not touched it. Across the display, letters populated one by one, with the calm certainty of a system retrieving a familiar record. Welcome back, donor Evan Morales. My badge hung untouched against my chest. I had never donated blood, not in this reality. The refrigerated air thickened, not warmer, not colder, denser, expectant. All around me, in rows stretching beyond the narrow reserve aisle, blood bags began to sway, not violently, gently, dozens at first, then hundreds. A soft, synchronized motion, as if some enormous pulse had passed through all the shelves at once and been answered by every sealed unit in turn. Plastic tapped plastic in tiny, polite collisions. The sound was almost delicate. It reminded me of prayer beads striking together in an old woman's hands. The scanner chimed again. A second line appeared beneath the first. Matching components found. I backed toward the door and hit metal immediately, though the aisle should have allowed 3 more steps. The cooler door had sealed. Frost feathered across its viewing pane from the inside out. Through the whitening glass, the hanging bags kept swaying in perfect unison. And under that soft plastic rustle, just at the edge of hearing, I caught the low collective rhythm I had first mistaken for compressor cycles in Phoenix years before. Inhale, hold, exhale, a building learning my name. I stood there with the unlabeled unit in my hand, my own handwriting taped across it like a warning from a life I had not lived, and understood the final cruelty of the thing. You can survive the crossing. You can even close it. But if blood has ever had reason to remember you, somewhere, some shift, some branch, some refrigerated dark, it keeps trying to hand you back. And this time, when the scanner chirped a third time, and the bags answered with that patient, swaying breath, I knew with a certainty, colder than fear, that whatever had found me here was no longer asking whether I believed it. It was asking whether I was finally ready to donate.